Three-dimensional teaching, Science Module A, Part 2. Our learning target for this module is, we will deepen our understanding of the Next Generation Science Standards Framework, or NGSS, with an emphasis on three-dimensional teaching around the science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and disciplinary core ideas. The science and engineering practices, or SEPs, is what the students will be doing, or the actions they will take to help them develop understanding. The disciplinary core ideas, or DCI, is the content knowledge we want them to gain, or the anchor. It is what teachers use to focus the curriculum, instruction, and assessments. Next, we have the cross-cutting concepts, or CCCs. They help link the learning from all domain areas, physical, earth, life, and engineering, all together. Think of the three components of three-dimensional learning as three intertwining strands of a rope. While the rope can be separated into its three different strands, the strength of the rope is determined by the strands working together. Separating the strands weakens the rope so that it is no longer effective for our intended use. So no one dimension is more important than the other. They are all equally important and must be taught together and not in isolation. We are going to watch a video entitled NGSS, of Visions for K-12 Science Education. As you watch the video, it might be helpful to print off the three-dimensional posters located on the assignment for this module and have them next to you as you watch. As you watch, try to identify the science and engineering practices, disciplinary core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts being used.
It's 1.2.
When we learn things, it isn't for memorizing a piece of information. Just reciting science facts or principles is not what we want children to be able to do. We want them to be able to go out in the world and make sense of novel phenomena. So making sense of things really is engaging in a performance and saying, I need to construct an explanation of why or how this occurs. Okay, let's get started.
Are you ready? 56.
Throughout the 2 days, I want you to engage as the scientist, you as the student, you as the learner.
If it was room temperature water, would it be behaving in the same way?
What's the science behind this? What's happening?
As teachers start focusing on the next generation science standards, they will be able to help students see science as it really is, that it's not just a set of steps and procedures.
The real hope is that they can make a connection between what we do in the modeling of performances of science and what they do in their classroom.
Oh, wow. In this day and age, one of the factors influencing the next generation science standards is the globalization, understanding we're in a global community. We're not kind of an isolated entity here.
The Next Generation Science Standards takes the vision from the framework for K-12 science education and puts it into a set of performance expectations. And it calls for the students to actively engage in science. It sets out parameters for science education, clear goals, along with describing the three dimensions that students can engage in to make sense of science. Three dimensions are the cross-cutting concepts, the science and engineering practices, and the disciplinary core ideas.
Most of those ideas are not new. The integration of them, pulling those three dimensions together, is new.
If we're going to have the kids doing that, instruction has to reflect that.
What I'm walking away from today, kind of a big shift for me, is we can focus in on something very specific to help teach a much broader, bigger idea, that it actually helps the students be able to do that application to new scenarios, new situations.
Cross-cutting concepts. There's 7 of them. The way we've organized them is around causality, structure and function, systems, scale and proportion, change and stability, matter and energy, and then the last thing, pattern. These cross-cutting concepts are tools that you provide to the children, and they use those tools to make sense of phenomena.
So we're looking for changes in the system.
There's condensation on the outside.
The cross-cutting concepts are a way of organizing the phenomena in terms of what the system is that's being studied. What did you define as your system?
We included in our system also the surrounding air.
The idea that there's a cause-effect relationship.
What's causing the cloudiness?
What's causing the bubbles to come off of the ice?
going to get pushed in the direction of the wind, right?
And finally, patterns used as evidence to support their explanations.
So to me, the pattern is just the fluttering back and forth, right? Do you have a question in mind?
Why that pattern, that
The
back and forth pattern?
What
Yeah.
if we change the direction of the flag? If we turn it this way?
Okay. I want to go inside and just make a little paper flag that we can blow on and manipulate.
The practices are a set of things that children do in engaging in science performances. Asking questions right here, that's what students do. As a professional teacher, you have to create an environment in which students are asking questions that help them make sense of things.
Ready?
150.
Why doesn't that ball return to that exact same level that you dropped it?
Engaging students in the practices really does pique their curiosity, and it helps them have a desire to go out and have more questions about the world, which asking questions is a practice. So it's something we want them to be able to do, to be able to discover more about the world.
What else contributes to it not reaching its maximum height that it started at?
The pull of gravity. Gravity is still pulling it back down even though it's bouncing up.
As learners, using evidence and using that evidence to construct explanations is important. I think having those experiences will really help students own the content.
More bounce, more energy in the bounce, and that's really the kinetic energy.
The last dimension of the core ideas, and there's nothing new here. We don't want kids at the end of instruction to recite the core ideas. We want them to use them in science performances, to make sense of novel phenomena, applying them to construct explanations and develop arguments.
So the alcohol is less dense than the ice. You can see the density in there is different.
Oh, yeah.
The core ideas in particular become valuable because we revisit them through every grade band, and they're moving forward in a very logical way. Those things we're asking them to do can be applied to more than just alcohol and water. It can be applied to cloud formation. It can be applied to condensation.
Why? What's happening?
I think what's exciting about the Next Generation Science Standards is this intersection of the three dimensions, and that we're not just working on practices one day. You really are infusing the three dimensions within the classroom.
One of the things that you've done is asking what if. By doing that, I have to be able to take what I know, what I've learned, looking at the models, looking at patterns, and applying them somehow to show that I understand what would happen if I changed a dynamic.
It's been real helpful to remember that, I can't do one without thinking about the other.
No change. We should add that, right?
That's how students are going to be thinking about them as well.
It's cute.
It's my hope that this will be the reform in science education that not only gets students more proficient in science, but builds interest in science.
Now that you are able to see the shift in science education and we're able to see teachers engaged in three-dimensional learning, we're going to look at each dimension a little closer by reading through the NGSS Three-Dimensional Learning article. As you read the article, highlight key terms and phrases about each of the dimensions. On your science module artifact document, create a statement to describe what three-dimensional teaching means to you now that you have seen the video and read the article. We will now dive deeper into each of the dimensions, starting with the science and engineering practices, also known as SEPs, or the actions the students will be involved in. SEPs are the action. It is what the students are doing. The students are asking questions. The students are designing investigations. We're going to watch a video to deepen our understanding of what the SEPs look like and sound like in the classroom. As you watch the video, be thinking about how do the practices engage the students in thinking deeply about their work? How are the practices interrelated? And how could you use the practices in your classroom?
More energy in the bounce, and that's really the kinetic energy.
As teachers, if we really find ways to get kids actively engaged,
Why? What's happening?
they're going to share what they've learned about science. They're going to be curious about things they see on television and that they read in the news. And hopefully then we'll have more people that really enjoy science and understand science.
As you engage in your science performance, I will want you to be thinking about what you're doing. Specifically, we'll be talking a lot about the practices.
The next generation science standards include 3 dimensions: science and engineering practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts.
I'd like you to think about that intersection of the 3 dimensions and where it's coming together in the classroom. For those of you that are familiar with the practices, there are 8.
Today we engage teachers in practices found within the framework for K-12 science education. They're designed for students. They're what we want students to be doing. The science performance that the participants engaged in today was specifically analyzing and interpreting data. We want to look at the scientific process and that this is what scientists go through in the real world.
As teachers, it's important for us to scaffold those experiences, especially early on, to make sure that they understand how to organize their data and look for patterns and evidence. So I think as they engage in these practices more often, I think they're really going to own those practices along with the content.
All we're changing is the height.
It's important that kids are constructing explanations, that they are constructing arguments.
Started at 70.
They're using evidence and they're communicating their findings.
In groups of 3, you will investigate the height that a golf ball bounces off of a hard surface. You'll choose 4 different drop heights. After you drop it, where it returns at its peak is going to be its bounce height.
That one's the 16, the 50.
Make sure you analyze your data with your groups. And then once you've identified the patterns, you're not done. You need to talk about what's causing those patterns to occur. What's the science behind this? What's happening?
More gravitational potential energy, since all we're changing is the height.
So we looked at that data to continue to look for that linear relationship. So that's a pretty traditional activity that you might do in terms of looking at the bounce height. But by really looking at the data closely and having to look for those relationships, it really increased the depth of that particular investigation.
So the lower you dropped it, the lower it bounced?
The closer it got back to its original.
So what does that tell you?
Nicole came by and we showed her our graph and our percentage difference, and she said, well, so why does that happen? What's going on? And that added really another layer of depth because we started talking about gravitational potential energy, kinetic energy, and then we shared out and really probed that in more depth.
The more kinetic energy we have, like a ratio.
Really made us think more deeply about gravity, energy, friction, and the system that was involved. So it was more than averaging data, calculating data, writing a conclusion. It really became more about why and what type of evidence do we have to really construct an explanation.
Any other patterns?
The higher the drop height, the larger difference between drop height and bounce height.
What's causing that pattern to occur?
Because gravity doesn't change. The system's constant.
Is there even a more simple pattern than that? Yeah.
It always bounced less than it was stopped from.
Why? What's causing that to happen?
So all of those different ideas that are in the science and engineering practices really get kids actively engaged. So they're really thinking. It's not confirming, but looking for more information. That focus on evidence-based explanations is really key and I think is essential in those practices.
What's different when you're having to analyze to come up with that?
Discovery. You're going to remember it more because you're doing it.
You're doing it. They're involved in doing it. That thinking process that goes on behind it is so much more critical than just receiving that information.
I'm really most excited about bringing home those ideas of thinking about labs that I already do that really could, be so much better if I really am more mindful of the science and engineering practices.
This particular performance really did emphasize analyzing data, yet a lot of you were starting to ask questions, which is exactly what we want to have happen. It's again an interrelated part of those practices coming out. You're using other practices at the same time.
So now you're going to start at 40 centimeters.
We started out gathering information, but once we started analyzing our data, we really realized we needed more data. So we went back and gathered more data. It was really a fluid process. The more we learned, the more that we did, the more questions that we had.
That works.
78.
Are you losing that each time it bounces?
Some of the excitement that I've seen with teachers is that they realize that this is really how learning occurs. Teachers that are teaching both science and mathematics can see how these practices really do interconnect.
And we had 84, so we were close. Yeah.
As you saw in the video, science and engineering practices combine the behaviors that scientists use as they investigate phenomena and practices engineers use to solve problems and design solutions. The SEPs focus on the knowledge and skills needed to do science. When students participate in practices, they are able to make the scientific knowledge more meaningful and embeds it more deeply into their worldview. We use the terms practices to emphasize that engaging in scientific investigation requires not only skill, but also knowledge that is specific to each practice. There are 8 science and engineering practices. A couple examples of how the science and engineering are combined would be the first SEP, ask questions and define problems. You start by asking questions like a scientist, and then defining the problem like an engineer. Another one would be constructing explanations, like a scientist, and designing solutions, like an engineer. Asking questions and defining problems, develop and use models, plan and carry out investigations, analyze and interpret data, use mathematics and computational thinking, constructing explanations and designing solutions, arguing from evidence, and obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information would be the 8 science and engineering practices. The science and engineering practices are written as a progression. The Next Generation Science Standards site has a document, which I linked under the resources of this assignment, which show how each of the SEPs progress by grade bands from kindergarten to 12th grade. Next, we will look at the disciplinary core ideas, or DCIs, which anchor the learning. The DCIs are what we have been focusing on for years, the content. The ideas have been broken down into 4 domains: physical, life, earth and space, and engineering, technology, and application of science. The codes listed below them are how they are referred to on the performance expectation coding, or known to us by our standard code. Remember, as you watch the video, that the DCIs anchor the learning and help to focus the content, instruction, and assessment. As you watch the video, be thinking about what are the disciplinary core ideas? How are the disciplinary core ideas used differently than content has been used in the past? And how do disciplinary core ideas progress through the grades?
Why is that?
The goal of instruction is for students to engage in making sense of the world. The disciplinary core ideas are the tools they use to make sense of the phenomena.
I want you to think about how instruction will get students to engage more deeply in using the core ideas.
The disciplinary core ideas are the content that can be used to construct explanations, and they can be used as a form of evidence to support arguments. And they use them in the context of practices and cross-cutting concepts. This idea of three-dimensional thinking really is well structured in the framework of Next Generation Science Standards, and it helps guide what students will be doing in the classroom.
We're going to focus on the intersection of 3 dimensions, but the feature is really the disciplinary core ideas.
The way they're used in the standards is distinguished from historically when we had students learning the content and then simply being able to tell us the content. These disciplinary core ideas are the things the students use.
I think the purpose of kind of current instruction is to get students to remember very specific facts about the particular content areas. But I think the new approach is that it's a progression from kindergarten on, and that they're slowly but surely building on these ideas. And I feel like with the way that the core ideas are presented now, it's much easier for teachers to see that progression, that it makes a bit more sense to them.
Disciplinary core ideas can be applied to multiple phenomena. There's one that talks about how energy is involved when matter changes. Well, that is true for when an ice cube melts. It's true when sunlight is used as the energy source for photosynthesis in a leaf. has that kind of utility across many, many phenomena, and this framework describes that.
So we're going to engage you in an investigation.
So the supercontinent began to break apart.
We had the opportunity to work with teachers, engaging them in core ideas and help them to understand and make connections to what they're currently doing and move them forward in their instruction.
Most mountain ranges are found near plate boundaries. How did the Rocky Mountains end up 2,000 miles from the coast? You ever wonder about that?
We completed a performance where we needed to do some research on how the Rocky Mountains were formed and what made them unusual.
I want you to think about the core ideas from the standards, specifically the Earth systems ideas related to plate tectonics. I want you to think about the theories that support your explanations and how they play a role in evidence.
Over time, it results in the creation of the mountain, like it's progressing outward.
They have to use disciplinary core ideas about forces, about motion, and about plate tectonics. So that core idea becomes very, very important to making sense of a phenomena that they never even heard about before.
There was an older mountain range 300 million years ago that eroded, and it was reformed into the Rocky Mountains.
So it was part of an old mountain range. How did that mountain range form?
I know.
I think it's so important for the students to be able to have these broad understandings of how their world works. And so as they come across a new phenomenon, they're going to be able to make some connections to past experiences and prior knowledge that's going to give them a better understanding of whatever's presented to them that's new. Two friends here, they're going to represent the North American plate. They're laying down. And on top of that plate are layers of sediment, shallow angle of the Pacific plate coming underneath. And so that uplifted the granite. And as that happened, some of the sediment came off, and then eventually through erosion, all of the sediment came off and revealed the granite.
Why did the
Rocky
sediment
Mountains.
wait until she uplifted to run off?
Gravity.
Gravity. And by the way, this idea of gravity is a core idea.
They did not gather information that told them exactly why. Without an understanding of a number of core ideas, they could not have come up with a performance to describe an explanation for it or develop a model to communicate why.
These plates, what happened to this plate?
It melted.
Is there a core idea that helps me make sense of that?
If we can focus in on something very specific to help teach a much broader, bigger idea, that it actually helps the students be able to do that application to new scenarios, new situations, by letting them really focus in and drill down on one specific example.
This idea that we've talked about today, how do you see something that you do being modeled like we modeled today become part of your instruction?
Kind of a big shift for me is that it's more about teaching the bigger picture so that students can apply that more generalized core idea to lots of different examples and not just one specific thing that they need to remember.
The DCIs focus K-12 science curriculum, instruction, and assessments on the most important aspects of science. In order to be a disciplinary core idea, a concept must meet 2 or more of the following criteria. Have a broad importance across multiple sciences or engineering disciplines. Be a key tool for understanding or investigating more complex ideas and solving problems. Relate to the interests and life experiences of students. And be teachable over multiple grades at increasing levels of depth and sophistication. A link to the disciplinary core ideas progression is linked in the resource section of this module's assignment. The third dimension we have is the cross-cutting concepts. The CCCs link all of the students' learning across science domains. As you watch the video, remember that the cross-cutting concepts link the learning across science domains so they can form deeper connections and understanding. As you watch the video, be thinking about how do students benefit from understanding the cross-cutting concepts? How do the NGSS use the cross-cutting concepts in a new way? And how did the task prompt participants to use the cross-cutting concepts?
As we think about science and the nature of science, it would be great to start thinking about what are in fact those underlying concepts that we can teach thinking about how that concept works and having that as the takeaway, conceptual understanding. Today, we're going to talk about cross-cutting concepts.
Okay, we need to describe the patterns.
We had the opportunity to work with teachers to model student science performances, and then to deconstruct that in conversations around how the framework and next generation science standards play out in classroom instruction.
And it points in the direction that the wind's blowing. That's a pattern.
Cross-cutting concepts are for the students to help them organize and make sense of the science. The way we've organized them is around causality, structure and function, systems, scale and proportion, change and stability, matter and energy, and then the last thing, pattern.
Cross-cutting concepts have been around a long time. What is a new innovation is the fact that they appear in the performance expectation in the standards, which they'll be assessed with two other dimensions: science and engineering practices and disciplinary core ideas. That's really what's new.
So when we engage you in a performance, we're going to be using 3 dimensions, but we're going to focus today on cross-cutting concepts.
In the past, teachers are familiar with the concepts and they've learned them through their schooling, but they're not always translating those to the students and making sure the students are understanding them. And so we need to shift those from being a tool for teachers to a tool for students to help build their understanding.
We want to engage you in a performance with a flag.
Tear some of it off, maybe.
In the performance, we engage them in a phenomena, flags waving in the wind.
You can construct it how you want. We can go outside. We can do it in here.
So in the activity, the question was, why does a flag wave in the wind? What questions would help us explain what's going on? We needed to develop some questions about that and research some information.
For those students, when they encounter a new phenomenon, they begin with saying, what is the system I'm studying?
I would say the flag. The flag itself is our model.
What is the scale of the system? What is changing in the system?
So basically, a flag is 2 triangles. The wave generates along the hypotenuse of this triangle. Right.
And what is causing that change to occur?
Why that pattern, back and forth pattern?
Are there patterns that make sense in this phenomenon that I'm studying? And have them kind of construct an explanation.
It flaps back and forth because it's like that Bernoulli principle.
Any other information? Here's the thing, you were saying something about gravity.
They went on the web for part of it. They went outside with the model. They investigated it.
What if you're right behind her, over her head?
You've got a consistent force acting on it. The task that Brett provided prompted us to think about cross-cutting concepts. And so we talked about things like how the wind was causing the flag to move, so cause and effect, how it related to energy because of the energy of the wind being transferred to the energy to the flag.
When you had it vertical, it acted as if it was which it wasn't, but it acted like it was in a vacuum.
We talked about what pattern can we observe in this system that we've seen before? How could we use a model to understand the system in a similar way that we've done? And so if students are doing that throughout their science education experience, then they will internalize those tools and be able to apply them in the future. It's more stable here, and you've got gravity exerting a lot of force on it. So that activity helped me think about making the cross-cutting concepts more explicit. The biggest way is just Brett's approach to questioning.
The less wind, the less flutter.
More flap.
Uh-huh.
So we're looking at patterns there, aren't we? And what causes the pattern to change? What if instead of a flag, I gave you a sheet of steel plate? Would it wave?
You need to have significantly more energy for that to take place.
What do you mean more energy?
We talked in the large group about what are some other examples where it does apply. And so I think that's exactly what the cross-cutting concepts are, is like where you can take something you learn in one setting and then connect it to other areas of that discipline or across disciplines.
And this is a scale question, one of the cross-cutting concepts. If this is my air particle, how large does that pole have to be?
I saw the aha moments today among teachers. They begin seeing how important it is to frame their questions, to use question stems that come right out of the cross-cutting concepts.
I want you to think about the cross-cutting concepts in light of instruction. How do I get the cross-cutting concepts to be featured in my classroom? Yes?
You taught systems rather than dividing it into earth and physical. And I see that as being a lot better for the kids because you're picking up on waves, you're taking it through every discipline in science.
Are systems in every discipline in science?
Yes.
Yeah. They are if you help students understand these cross-cutting concepts.
One thing that we talk about, recently in education is that when students leave school, we don't know really what lays ahead for them in terms of jobs and in terms of, if they go into science. And so I think if students have this connected, kind of network of knowledge, they realize that this concept I learned maybe in biology class, I can apply it other places. It's not limited to biology, and so therefore, when they go out into the workforce doing research in whatever setting, they can apply a concept learned in this setting to some setting that initially may seem totally different, but it really can be related.
They must become familiar touchstones. There's something that is brought up every day that the students use to support their understanding of science.
After watching the video, I hope you saw that the cross-cutting concepts are fundamental concepts that bridge science ideas across the 4 domains: physical, life, earth, and engineering. There are 7 cross-cutting concepts: patterns, cause and effect, scale, proportion, and quantity, systems and system models, energy and matter, structure and function, and stability and change. In the resource section of this assignment, the Next Generation Science document outlining the cross-cutting progression has been linked. The CCCs are also documented by grade bands from kindergarten to 12th grade. Here are some takeaways around the 3-dimensional teaching. Students are the ones using 3 dimensions: the science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and the disciplinary core ideas. The 3 dimensions work together to create opportunities for students to explore, examine, explain, and design solutions. Students making sense of the phenomena now drives the teaching and learning process. Students learn content by engaging in practices, they learn the ideas or content by making sense of the phenomena, and they will use concepts to link the content across domains of science to deepen their understanding. 3-dimensional teaching is like cooking. The kitchen tools need to make a meal are like the science and engineering practices. It is what the students are doing. The basic ingredients in your meal are like the disciplinary core ideas. It is the substance or content the students need. Lastly, we have the herbs, spices, and seasoning, which would be the cross-cutting concepts. The cross-cutting concepts pull the learning together to make it meaningful. It adds spice. Using the tools, ingredients, and spices to prepare a meal would be like 3-dimensional teaching. You need all 3 parts for students to make meaning of the learning. 3-dimensional teaching in the classroom. The new classroom experience asks students to play the role of scientists and engineers, take ownership of their learning, and work with the content and engage in their practices. That is how the practices connect with the disciplinary core ideas. The content background is the disciplinary core idea, and the way content behaves in the context is the cross-cutting concept. Your task would be to individually reflect on how you could start implementing 3-dimensional teaching into your classroom. Create some steps you could take to meet your individual needs. Record these steps on your science module artifact document.